He was never supposed to inherit Syria. That is where the story of Bashar al-Assad becomes unsettling, because his rise did not begin with destiny. It began with substitution. Bashar was the quieter son, the one studying ophthalmology in Damascus and then training in London, while his older brother Basil was widely seen as the natural heir to Hafez al-Assad's system. But Basil died in a car crash in 1994, and the regime did what dynastic security states do when succession suddenly opens. It reached for blood before it reached for legitimacy. Bashar was pulled back, groomed, promoted through the military, and made ready for a future that had not originally belonged to him. When Hafez died in 2000, the transition was engineered with the speed of a system that had already decided the answer before anyone was allowed to ask the question. Bashar came in looking like a break from the past. He was younger, Western-educated, more restrained in style, less theatrical than the old Arab strongman mold. In the beginning, that mattered. He released hundreds of political prisoners, loosened some restrictions on discussion, and for a brief period, Syria seemed to flirt with the possibility of something softer, something that later became known as the Damascus Spring. That was the first illusion around Bashar al-Assad, that the new face might mean a new system. But the deeper truth was harder and colder. Bashar had not inherited a presidency in the ordinary sense. He had inherited a machine built by his father over decades, one rooted in Ba'ath party control, security surveillance, and the assumption that the state existed first to protect the ruling core. He could change the tone without changing the structure. He could sound modern without becoming accountable. He could look less brutal without surrendering any of the mechanisms that made brutality possible. And in Syria, that distinction was everything. The Assad system did not need Bashar to be his father's clone. It only needed him to understand what could never be permitted to move beyond the family's grasp: the army, the intelligence services, the party, and the emotional boundary between fear and obedience. That is why the opening years of his rule feel so important in retrospect. They were not simply the beginning of a dictatorship. Syria already had one. They were the beginning of a misreading. People looked at Bashar and thought they were seeing transition. What they were really seeing was continuity in a younger suit. The son who had not been meant to rule would spend the next years proving that he could do something almost more dangerous than simple inheritance. He could make an old system look newly possible just long enough for people to lower their guard before discovering that the machine had not changed at all. The reform image did not collapse in one dramatic moment. It tightened, almost quietly, until people realized that the opening had limits, and then realized those limits were the point. Bashar's early gestures had created hope among intellectuals, activists, and ordinary Syrians who wanted to believe that the country might move away from the suffocating habits of Hafez-era rule. Discussion circles emerged. Political debate felt less impossible. The regime looked, for a fleeting moment, as if it might tolerate the idea that criticism was not treason. But within months, the old instincts reasserted themselves. Threats returned. Arrests followed. The Damascus Spring was extinguished before it could become anything irreversible. That reversal matters because it revealed the central contradiction of Bashar al-Assad's rule. He could market the language of modernization while preserving the logic of authoritarianism almost untouched. He did not need to abolish hope immediately. It was more useful to let hope breathe just long enough to identify where it lived. After that, his Syria settled into something more familiar. The state remained firmly authoritarian. Real power stayed within the security apparatus, the ruling circle, and the family network that had carried the regime this far. Bashar's marriage to Asma al-Assad reinforced the carefully managed image of a polished, modernizing presidency, the sort of leadership Western observers often want to find in authoritarian systems before the evidence has earned it. But image was never the substance of the regime. Substance was coercion, centralization, and the continued assumption that Syrian political life could never be allowed to organize independently of Assad rule. By the late 2000s, the regime had shown that it would permit cosmetic freshness but not structural risk. That is what makes Bashar's second act so dark. He was not a blunt relic like some of the region's older rulers. He represented a more contemporary authoritarian style: calm voice, reform vocabulary, dynastic core. He could appear managerial while sitting atop one of the most security-heavy systems in the Arab world, and that made his eventual choices more revealing, not less. When mass protest finally arrived, the question was never whether Bashar preferred openness in theory. The question was whether he would accept any form of politics that diluted the inherited supremacy of the Assad state. Syria's answer came in 2011, and it was devastating. Because when the moment of real testing arrived, the reformer image did not merely crack. It dissolved. Underneath it was the old system, still intact, still armed, and still convinced that the survival of the regime mattered more than the survival of the country around it. When the Arab Spring reached Syria in March 2011, the protests did not begin as a civil war. They began as what authoritarian dynasties fear most: ordinary public defiance breaking the spell of inevitability. Demonstrations calling for reform and, increasingly, for Bashar al-Assad's removal broke out in southern Syria and then spread across the country. The regime answered with violence. Police, military, and paramilitary forces were deployed to crush the demonstrations, and what might have remained a political crisis escalated into something far more permanent and ruinous. By September 2011, the peaceful uprising had become an armed insurgency. That transition was not an accident of chaos. It was shaped by the regime's choice to treat protest not as a warning, but as an existential threat that had to be smashed before it could become contagious. This was the moment Bashar ceased to be the disappointed reform hope and became unmistakably the ruler willing to break Syria rather than risk losing it. The war that followed would come to define his name. Cities were battered, neighborhoods besieged, detainees disappeared into prison systems associated with torture and death, and the regime's effort to retake or hold territory turned Syria into one of the most devastating conflicts of the century. Britannica notes that Assad's attempt to repress the uprising included brutal tactics, most infamously the use of chemical weapons. At the same time, Syrian officials repeatedly denied using chemical weapons, even as multinational investigations later documented numerous chemical attacks in the war. That combination of horror and denial became part of the regime's signature. Overwhelming force followed by contested narrative, destruction followed by insistence that reality belonged to whoever still held the institutions of state. Bashar's rule was no longer merely authoritarian. It had become war-dependent. Every month of survival deepened the regime's message to Syrians. There would be no negotiated political life that genuinely threatened the center. There would only be endurance, attrition, and the possibility that the regime could outlast the country's capacity to resist. In that sense, Assad did not simply face a civil war. He learned to inhabit one. War became the environment in which the regime could justify anything, centralize everything, and call the resulting devastation necessity. This is what made his system darker than the early reform illusion had allowed people to imagine. Bashar was not just preserving his father's state. He was radicalizing the price of its survival. He was proving that dynastic security rule in the 21st century could still function the old way, through repression so severe that the world would eventually be forced to debate not whether the country had been broken, but whether the man who broke it was still politically useful enough to endure. And endure he did, for years longer than many predicted. Because Bashar al-Assad did not survive the war alone. He survived it through alliance, fragmentation, and the grim advantage held by regimes that are willing to destroy more of their own country than their enemies can afford to lose. Iran backed the Syrian government. Hezbollah fighters entered the battlefield on Assad's side. Russia's intervention later reshaped the military balance and helped the regime recover major cities and much of the country's populated west. That support mattered because by then the Syrian state was no longer functioning as a normal national government, even when it retained official form. It was a war state held together by foreign assistance, intelligence networks, military force, and the conviction that no political alternative should be permitted to consolidate. The human cost was catastrophic. Reuters summarized the war after Assad's fall as a conflict that killed hundreds of thousands and displaced half the Syrian population. Britannica notes that by 2018, there were 6.7 million Syrian refugees and an estimated 6.5 million displaced inside the country, a humanitarian shock so vast that Syria became the source of the largest refugee population in the world at that time. That scale matters because it reveals the full structure of Assad's survival. The regime did not preserve Syria in order to save itself. It saved itself by allowing Syria to be shattered. Whole cities were reduced to rubble. Millions were pushed across borders or into internal displacement. The country became a battleground for regional and international powers, a map of front lines rather than a coherent civic space. Yet through all of this, Assad's core proposition remained unchanged. He was still the state, still the only acceptable center, still the figure around whom foreign allies and domestic institutions were expected to organize. That is the paradox of his long survival. Outsiders often described him as resilient, but resilience suggests adaptation that preserves life. What Assad preserved was rule. The country paid the price. Over time, some foreign governments recalibrated, not because the regime had become humane, but because it had become durable. Durability can create its own dangerous legitimacy. If a ruler lasts long enough amid horror, the world begins to treat endurance as evidence of inevitability. Assad benefited from that logic for years, but he never solved the underlying contradiction. A regime sustained by fear, allied force, and national fragmentation can hold territory. It can reclaim cities. It can force people into silence. What it cannot easily do is rebuild genuine political legitimacy once the country has learned that its ruler will accept almost unlimited destruction in exchange for staying seated. Syria under Assad became the clearest version of that truth. The regime survived. The country broke. In the end, Bashar al-Assad did not fall because his system softened. He fell because systems built on fear can look permanent right up to the moment their external supports shift and their internal fragility is exposed all at once. In late 2024, an offensive led by Hayat Tahrir al-Sham and allied rebel forces moved with startling speed. Reuters reported that rebels seized Damascus on December 8, 2024, after a lightning advance that sent Assad fleeing to Russia, ending 6 decades of his family's autocratic rule. Britannica likewise records that an offensive led by HTS in November and December 2024 ousted Assad from power. The swiftness of that collapse is what gives the story its final shape. For more than 13 years, Assad had survived what many assumed would finish him: mass protest, rebellion, international condemnation, battlefield setbacks, economic ruin, and the moral exposure that comes with ruling through atrocity. He had survived because the regime was brutal, because its allies were powerful, and because Syria had been fragmented into so many armed and geopolitical layers that simple regime change seemed impossible. Then, suddenly, it happened. Reuters later reported that Assad had kept his escape plan secret from aides, officials, and even relatives, eventually ending up in Moscow, where Russia granted him asylum. That detail feels painfully fitting. A ruler who had spent years demanding total loyalty, left by deception and flight, exiting not as the indispensable center of Syria, but as the final refugee of his own system. This is why Bashar al-Assad's story belongs so naturally in a dark political documentary. He did not simply inherit a dictatorship and maintain it. He inherited a dynastic security state, briefly wore the mask of reform, then pushed the system through a war so devastating that survival itself came to seem like his only ideology. In the process, he proved something deeply unsettling about modern authoritarian power. It does not always need to inspire. Sometimes it only needs to outlast, to brutalize, and to convince enough of the world that collapse would be worse than continuity. Assad ruled that way until continuity finally failed. But the real scandal of his story is larger than his fall. It is that an entire country was dragged through siege, displacement, foreign intervention, and mass death in the service of preserving one family's hold on the state. When the regime finally gave way, it did not reveal a stable order waiting underneath. It revealed the wreckage that decades of dynastic rule and 13 years of war had left behind. Bashar al-Assad survived by turning Syria into a battlefield. When he fell, the battlefield remained.